Well, ladies and gentlemen, in this video, we are going to be discussing September 11th and Osama bin Laden. Did he really think the towers were going to fall? What was the strategy behind that? It was more of a wide-scale attack. It was really not focused on the Twin Towers, but because of what happened on September 11th, it was pretty much known for the collapse of the Twin Towers and the Pentagon getting hit. No one really talks about that. Obviously, the plane crashing in Pennsylvania, very likely headed for the U.S. Capitol, although some people will argue possibly the White House. Now, when it comes to both of the Twin Towers, the idea of flying airplanes into them, we do have to go back to the early 1990s. You did have Ramzi Yousef, who, believe it or not, was significantly worse than any of the 9/11 hijackers. They tried blowing up the North Tower. And actually, believe it or not, they wanted the North Tower to fall onto the South Tower and create a domino effect. It would have been horrible, but it only ended up killing 6 people. The bomb, they detonated it right up against the wall of the North Tower, and the bomb really went under, not above. It was in the parking garage. So they've been really targeting the Twin Towers, and bin Laden, when they watched the first plane hit the building, or when it was all over the news, they were cheering, they were all happy. When the first tower fell, which would have been the South Tower, this is a rumor. Apparently, bin Laden got really scared and nervous because he said, this is going to be really bad. They're going to come after us. They wanted to send a message, and it was going to be more so like September 11th was going to be, it's like an attack in terms of explosions. You know, when you see the North Tower get hit, it's an explosion. When the South Tower gets hit, it's an explosion. When the Pentagon gets hit, it's an explosion. There really wasn't the thought of a potential catastrophic situation that ended up happening. And the reason when it comes to 9/11, all anyone thinks about is the Twin Towers is because of how crazy it actually was. The first plane hits the North Tower. Every single feed cuts to that. Everybody sees the South Tower get hit. Everybody sees the South Tower fall. Everybody sees the North Tower fall. It's like it's straight out of a nightmare. So originally they thought the planes would crash into the North and the South Tower, and it would catch on fire, the interior would be burning, but they were not expected to collapse. And you can see, I mean, the firefighters going up in the North Tower, they were in the South Tower as well. Many architects did not expect the Twin Towers to collapse, and that does, of course, bring on a bunch of conspiracy theories. I can't take credit for this. Somebody else said it, but I saw it in a comment. When it comes to like the idea that they had explosives in the towers and that's what were used to bring the towers down, because you would think, well, if bin Laden didn't think the towers were going to collapse, if there were firefighters going into the buildings, something else had to bring the towers down. Why would all these people, think they're not going to collapse when they end up collapsing and killing everyone? Well, think about when the buildings collapsed, both the North and the South Tower, and I've already talked about the South Tower, the way it leans. It's just very unlikely that an explosion would cause the South Tower to collapse. The North Tower is harder to see because of all the smoke that was caused by the South Tower, but we all know, and this is something that I've talked about extensively because it's very interesting, when both of the towers fall, the building core remains up. If you've got an explosion, stemming from the bottom, the building core, it's very unlikely that it would remain up in an explosion scenario, but it does. And that would beckon to the idea where the failure of the buildings happen where they were hit or lower in terms of where the jet fuel went. And it's not even just that, it's just the way the Twin Towers were built with the building core localized. It put so much stress onto the walls of the Twin Towers. So bin Laden going into this, he didn't think they were going to collapse. Pretty much nobody thought they were going to collapse. I mean, you would think the plane basically was absorbed by the tower. That's what it looked like when the North Tower got hit, because it was going so quickly and the tower is just so much bigger than the plane. When you look at that crash, you don't think, oh, that building's going to collapse. You really don't, just because the tower is immensely bigger than that airplane. And that's what, bin Laden thought. It was more so just explosion, the Twin Towers, because they were obsessed with hitting the Twin Towers. Again, that started back in the early 1990s, targeting the towers with some crazy stuff, Ramzi Yousef, and then they catch Yousef in Pakistan in like 96, and they expedite him to the United States, and he's flying in a helicopter above the Twin Towers, and one of the people, one of the security within the helicopter turns to him and says, they're still standing because he tried to collapse the towers in 93. And then he said something about not having enough money. He said if we had more money, they'd be down. And honestly, he probably is correct. And then you think about Ramzi Youssef in general getting the news in a prison, probably Florence, the maximum security prison in Colorado. That's where a lot of high profile criminals are. But imagine you're Ramzi Youssef. You try bringing the towers down in 93. It doesn't work. You're in jail, for life, obviously. And in 2001, you get the news that they collapsed both of the Twin Towers. I mean, that's just a crazy thing. So they were targeting the towers, and they thought the planes would get flown into the towers, they would burn for a while, and then they'd also hit the Pentagon, and then they'd also hit the U.S. Capitol, and it was going to be a widespread event. But really, nobody cares at this point. Not to say it wasn't a big deal, but nobody really cares about the Pentagon being hit, mainly because, the Pentagon is a horizontal building. It just, like 20, not even 20%, I would say like 12% of the Pentagon, like a wing of the Pentagon was destroyed. That's it. And then obviously the White House or the Capitol, neither of them got hit because the plane crashed in Pennsylvania. That was mainly because, of course, the revolt, it happening later in the day, that the passengers realizing what was going to happen and that they were going to die or the plane was going to be flown into something. So they wanted to take it over, of course. But it wasn't just that. It was also because on that airplane, the hijackers waited too long. Nobody really knows why. I mean, obviously you can kind of guess they were probably really nervous, but they waited far too long, and they actually turned the plane over Cleveland when it really should have been turned about 20 to 25 minutes before. And that also helped the passengers have more time in terms of actually arriving to the District of Columbia to crash the plane into the Capitol or the White House, wherever they were going. So the gist of it is, this was supposed to be revenge on America, and I think they thought the 9/11 attack would almost feel a lot more political than it was, because two of the places they targeted, the Pentagon and likely the U.S. Capitol, the Pentagon barely got hit and the U.S. Capitol didn't get hit at all. But you know what got hit? Both of the Twin Towers. Both of the towers collapsed. All the videos, because all the news cameras are on the North Tower burning, the South Tower gets hit by the plane, and then catches both of them collapsing as well and creating just that crazy dust cloud over New York that lingered for multiple weeks after. And so the entire event changed with the towers falling and really nobody caring about the Pentagon because there was such limited damage, and also just the catastrophic nature of two 110-story buildings falling within a 30-minute time frame in a densely populated area. That is something that simply will never happen in the history of the world again. And that is why it's like, whoa. The Twin Towers were very unique in and of itself, to where you've got two towers that are the exact same and they're as tall as they were. And then they both get hit and fall almost simultaneously within a half an hour time frame. So it kind of changed the direction and the course of the attack. And if you remember, George W. Bush, his approval rating, George W. Bush had the highest approval rating after September 11th in history of approval ratings since we started doing it. I think they started tracking approval ratings back in the 60s or 70s. And George W. Bush was like 89% approval because there was a patriotism in the air, and all Americans wanted to band together. And it is kind of interesting. Bush, his approval rating tanked throughout his presidency to the point where in 2007 and 2008, I believe it was under 40%. But I kind of got off track there. Overall, Osama bin Laden, a lot of Al-Qaeda, they did not think the towers would fall. And you can hear bin Laden in the transcripts talk about how the muscle hijackers were only told about the plan like days or like right before they took off on those planes. They knew they were dying, but they just didn't know how. They knew it was a sacrifice. They knew it was martyrdom. They just didn't really understand what was happening. The only ones that knew were the four pilots because they had to go train. And one of the pilots, obviously, the ringleader, Muhammad Atta. So guys, that is going to do it for this video. Make sure you follow me on X. Link to that's always in the description.